The thing about sustainability is it doesn't stand alone. It's kind of this interstitial space that actually can touch so many parts of the world we live in. One way to think about it is there's both the carrot and the stick around this world of sustainability, and that's fundamental to how action can happen. I think transparency is the name of the game. So we can be more honest about what can we control, what decisions do I get to make, and where does that control get transferred to somebody else? Infrastructure hadn't really been an area of focus, partly because it was hard to measure.
Hello, you're listening to Sustainable Infrastructure, an ORIS podcast where engineers, policymakers, and construction leaders share their experience on how they act for sustainable infrastructure. I'm Ronald Montagnac, co-founder at ORIS, and today I'm receiving Marta Bouchard, Sustainability Solutions Director at Autodesk. Hello, Marta. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Renaud. Thanks for inviting me today.
Yeah. Can you give us a brief presentation of yourself and your background?
Yeah. Well, so my name is Marta Bouchard. I work at Autodesk. Autodesk is a technology company. We make software for the design and make industries that ranges from manufacturing and product design to architecture, engineering, and construction, and even media and entertainment. And so we're a software company. My role at Autodesk is to lead a sustainability solutions team. We are a small group in a big company that are motivated to build technology so that sustainable outcomes can be had through the use of those technical tools.
And fantastic. And from a personal background or flow, how did you get into sustainability? Is it
Yeah.
from the beginning or?
Yeah, it's a fun story to tell. I actually have a background in design and architecture. I studied that in university, and I went off into the world actually in the field of architecture and practiced building buildings and learning along the way. But I was always very passionate about sustainability. I originally learned about it in university, and I started to apply that in my work. And I quickly decided that sustainability was the place for me. And so I spent many years actually as a sustainability consultant, so working with practitioners in the built environment to design and build and operate sustainable buildings and infrastructure. And I love that work. It was great. You know, we thought about sustainability across so many dimensions: energy and water and materials and human health. Sustainability is many things, right? And so consulting gave me a lot of exposure to not only the breadth and depth of what does sustainability mean, but a lot of deep understanding on how to help multifaceted teams, diverse stakeholders try to work together to actually implement sustainability, because it really does involve quite a lot of effort across teams. And I did that for a long time. I, did a lot of certifications on buildings and metrics and master planning and lots of different types of projects. But I hit a point in my career where, it was great to work on high performance projects and driving sustainability. However, I felt like it wasn't scalable as one person. And so about 4 years ago, I made a big move to the world of technology. And I'm really truly sitting on the other side of the table now. I used to be a user of software, right? I'd use technology to analyze and to design and to iterate and to measure sustainability outcomes. And now at Autodesk, being on a team and working with the makers of software, I feel that I can really scale the opportunities so that other people can bring sustainable design and construction practices into their workflows. And so bottom line is, it's a great way to democratize those capabilities for more people to be able to do this type of work and to ultimately design and make more sustainable projects.
Yeah, for sure, because I think Autodesk is really embedded into this ecosystem used by so many people in the industry, in the infrastructure industry as well. And how would you define or describe also your approach and within your team to deploy or to connect
Yeah.
this to sustainability?
Yeah, actually executing on that passion is definitely the crux of the job now. So I lead, like I said, I lead like a sustainability solutions team. We work the across the business of technology, which has a lot of parts to it to actually make software. So um, my team's job is to position Autodesk and extend our technology so that we can ultimately transform those industries. But what's happening behind the scenes is a lot of collaboration, not just on product, but actually the sort of business models for that and the go-to-market needs. Because you can build all the great software in the world, but if no one knows how to find it, or if no one knows how to use it, what's the point? So I often think of this role as being like a total translator between understanding what professional practitioners do, and so we can interpret what they need in their everyday work, and also being able to translate that to the different creators of across our business that need to build the build the product, understand the user workflows, think about how to bring that to the marketplace so people can access it, they know how to use it, and they can ultimately put it to practice in their projects. So my team works with all those different functions of the business to drive sustainability. It's a very horizontal role, and it's it's basically bringing subject matter expertise to a lot of different stakeholders that need to work together to make it scale.
And I mean, you said translator. I have also a feeling that you're a connector into that ecosystem because, as you said,
Mm.
solution exist, but how do we connect these solutions with the customers? And from a designer perspective, I mean, the pain is existing. How can I solve my sustainability calculation, carbon reduction, all these um, of these questions that are not always easy on the shelf or without deep knowledge and so translating but also connecting yeah how do you see that connections going that connection going?
Yeah, well, it starts with basic awareness and sort of fundamental principles. I'll guess I'll start with saying that as a company, Autodesk is built on a foundation where sustainability is part of our corporate strategy. So my team is instrumental in building that strategy. And as a company, it's really important that we walk the talk, right? So I'll start by saying that we have to be able to demonstrate that we know what we're doing, not just to build product, but also to operate as a business that can demonstrate sustainability. So within our own business operations, we embed sustainability across different programs, across our own corporate reporting metrics. We do everything we can really to show that we are modeling what sustainable business practices are. Then another thing we do, part of our corporate impact strategy, is making sure, and this is where my team primarily focuses, but making sure we're activating that potential through all the users of software, right? So our customers are fundamentally the end the end consumer of the product that we make, and so we work to partner with those customers so that they can connect their data and their workflows and their teams to drive those outcomes. And then the third thing that I think you're getting at is how we also engage in a wider ecosystem. So we're just one player in a very dynamic world of how buildings and infrastructure get designed, built, made, operated, renovated, and maintained, right? And the ecosystem all around us is critical to address sustainability at a global scale. It's very multifaceted, and we make sure to help kind of catalyze that outside the walls of what we can control within our product development as partners to that ecosystem, whereby we can kind of represent the technology as a tool, as a lever for change, and then making sure we're part of the collective action that it takes, because we recognize we're an enabler through technology, and yet there's so many other actors that are necessary to reduce the barriers and strengthen the market and the incentives that are needed for this work that isn't done by just one entity to actually happen.
And so how do you also identify? At some point, we could say, okay, Autodesk could have built everything, but no, it's not true. So how do you
Right.
identify and connect partners and partners from the customer side, but also from the technology side? So how do you
Yeah,
walk
that's
through that and identify these and build up these connections?
yeah, it's a great question because as I kind of alluded to, we're not the only we're not the only part of this ecosystem for sustainable change. Yes, I mentioned that customers are kind of the end user that can put technology as a tool to practice, but partners are absolutely instrumental. Autodesk builds a product that serves as really foundational core technical tools that can be used to do computer-aided design or building information models and product lifecycle management, right? These are things that folks need to do, but no one tool fits all, right? And so partners are a really important part of the ecosystem. Often that's where specialized technologies come into play. We work to integrate those specialized technologies so that, critical gaps, niche industries, very specific applications of software often needs an overlay of something really bespoke to a certain domain or a certain professional practitioner. And therefore, we put a lot of attention on the partner ecosystem that can build upon and extend or augment what I called kind of core software as a way to tailor the needs to what are very diverse needs. Now, that's not just specific to sustainability, that's just fundamental to what it takes to design and manage a digital platform. And actually, that's maybe a segue to talk about, what is the power of, a platform. And we're often hearing this phrase, oh, digital transformation. Well, I'll say that we're in the middle of that. Our partner ecosystem is just one of the, constituents of this transformation. But we're all living in an era now where we've got smartphones in our hands, we've got computers on our desks, and these are tools in which the modern world happens around us, including what we design and make. Well, that it's a very dynamic space. Software is constantly changing. Just as you update the apps on your phone, you need to update the software on your computer. And what once used to be, floppy disks or CDs or what we call desktop products, well, we're in the age of cloud computing, cloud connections, and data connectivity. That's all in the cloud, and that is powered by platform. This idea that a platform ecosystem can digitally connect so much more than we can all do individually. And so Autodesk is on this terrific journey, transforming from what had been, a desktop universe to the future of platform. And our partners are part of making that happen, right? Building the networks, getting the integrations to work. That's fundamental to how the data can flow, how teams can be connected, and it's maybe it sounds a little uh, a little techie with the vocabulary, but it's all around us. Like people just maybe don't have a name for what you're doing every day when you're cooking in the kitchen or using your smartwatch or whatever. This is all the power of platform, and so bringing it full circle to like why am I here? Because if we want to think about the opportunity for sustainability, we've got to leverage all the tools that we have, and the platform is the thing that can connect us all together. So full
Exact,
circle.
and if you think, okay, but why am I adopting such technologies, the phones? Why should I update my phone? And
Yeah.
it's because it's providing me value. I mean, I feel that it's easier to perform this or that, and what in terms of bringing sustainability through technology to let's say Autodesk customers in the world, what do you feel are the strongest value that can be provided? Is it in terms of time, access to carbon? a better understanding of carbon, reducing carbon,
Yeah,
what the feedback you can hear from your customer in terms of, okay, I'm doing that not because it's technology. I mean, no one is doing technology for technology, but it's
right.
bringing my value. So what are the value that engineers that
Yeah.
are listening to us or that are using some technology would expect to get out of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Nobody builds technology for the sake of building technology. It is a it is a means to an end, but is not the end, right? Um, well, and you mentioned some sustainability things in there, so let's unpack that a bit. Carbon. Um, yeah, carbon hopefully is a generally understood concept around how we measure kind of the environmental impacts of how humans are, consuming resources on this earth, right? I mean, that's what we do. We need to eat and have roofs over our heads, and we're a species that thrives in the built environment. And to make all that happen, it does require energy and materials and, the earth's resources. And we measure all that as carbon. And it's kind of become the de facto metric, and notwithstanding, like, has been, ratified and unified by global commitments and agreements like the Paris Agreement. And that's a way to baseline and measure sustainability. And that as a measure then becomes something that we can embed in technology. Again, technology
Mm.
as a means to an end. What tends to be misunderstood about sustainability is that it stands alone, right? Oh, let's do the things we have to do, and then, oh, let's also do sustainability. Well, the thing about sustainability is it doesn't stand alone. It's kind of this, like, interstitial space that actually can touch so many parts of the world we live in. You can take it into your personal life, but certainly we can do it in the built environment. And so, to answer your question, if technology is just a means to an end, it can be a lever that we pull. We think about it as a way to help solve some of the complexity around sustainability. And so, sustainability, in a word, is often about having the right data. And that right and the data could be, how much does this matter if I measure my energy consumption, or how much water it takes to cool my data center, or how much asphalt do I need to pave that road that needs to be repaired. All those things are energy and materials that require some degree of data. Where did the materials come from? How long did
Mm.
it take to drive it in a truck from point A to point B? When I say data, it really just means all those points that happen in this wider system of the world can be simplified as data points. And so technology is an ecosystem that can bring that data together. And so if sustainability data needs to be aggregated and measured and maybe even reported, because you need to show that you
Mm.
counted, you have the impacts of your project, it it's maybe overly reductionist, but it's about bringing that sustainability data into one place so that we make choices and decisions that are considering different data points, and moving users and individuals who have to make those decisions, be it about design or cost or ROI, that they can say, well, let me measure, let me look at the data, let's see how it compares to something I'm trying to do, let's iterate. And it all comes back to data, and technology is a way in which to bring that together.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think there is a definite gap and difficulty to close that gap to that's what I want to do, but I don't know how to perform, and connecting to data is important. I feel there are more also more resistance that are into this not the ecosystem. It's not voluntary resistance, but there are more pains that we can solve, and we need to solve through this transformation. Um, um, Specifically, still because it's isolated, it still takes a lot of time to perform. It still requires some, I mean, time is money, specifically in the engineering
Mm,
world. So how do we translate that? I think data is one element of this
it is,
answer, and
yeah,
and yeah, maybe other. I've seen many actors, engineering firms moving to performing this calculation for a project, another one deployed? How do we scale such things? What are the main barriers? How do you see this?
Yeah. Well, okay, let's just say that one more time. It is not just data, right? That's a way that, in the context of how does technology, matter in all this, it's because it's a place to bring data together. But the other big thing are people. I mean, it's the people that need to imagine the opportunity, build a plan, execute on that plan, and then, make all this happen. So the stakeholders of our kind of like it, our systems are the ones that can choose to use that data or not, but they're the ones that ultimately need to, design, build, make, manage, sort of the full execution. Um, it starts with awareness. There are other drivers that uh, motivate folks. Maybe it's regulatory. There's a whole world of, I'll call them sustainable regulations, just to keep it simple, but there's many permutations of regulations uh, that almost obligate folks to start thinking about sustainability more. Not everywhere, there's global differences and there are things, but we one way to think about it is there's both the carrot and the stick around this world of sustainability, and that's fundamental to how action can happen. So by carrot, I mean, the idea that you're kind of motivated to do the right thing, or maybe you have as a commitment personally or as a company to be more sustainable, to reduce your energy or carbon footprint, or to be a leader among your peers to be sustainably minded as a mission. That's sort of one driver. Then the other is more like I said, the stick. It's often more regulatory. It's rule based. One must do this in order to get your permit to build, or in order to maybe get a cost savings on your energy bills or something. So it's a mix of the carrot and the stick to motivate and to drive this stakeholder action. And so it's really a very complex system. When we zoom out a little bit, technology just being a piece, design practitioners in the built environment, engineers, architects, planners, owners, developers, and then users, communities, right? Hospitals, school systems, our extended families, right? They're all part of this whole system. And so it's a very dynamic space to drive that awareness, to get to those outcomes. It takes time and it takes a village. And when I mentioned that Autodesk and the work that my team tries to do, it's not just building the software, it's actually catalyzing those different parts of the system, because we have to come together to actually meet those sustainable objectives.
Yeah, and I feel that's something that is really well done. Every year, I think it's take more room, and we see that, as you said, I mean, awareness, giving the ability to the user to measure and get conscious of what it means, CO2 emissions, and give some capability to identify and reduce them. I mean, these are all catalyzing the transformation. I mean, this is
Yeah,
really, really a great move. I mean, this is not only a digital transformation; it's a sustainable transformation
it's a
for
system
the.
transformation. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Um, when we think about Autodesk, obviously we think about drawings, BIM, and so on.
Mm.
I like also to speak about the work and the project you've led on from a model to carbon measurement involving
Ah,
multiple practitioners. How do we improve our processes and identify all these difficulties? Because at the end, we need also to be able to measure and to build trust into these measurements. And I have a few questions around that. So
yeah,
maybe just if you can introduce that topic and we'll
yeah.
get into that.
Thanks.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about a interesting piece of work that we've been doing for the last few years. And Renaud, you've seen some of it in action. So I'll start by saying, across the realm of sustainability, and I already said, technology is one of many parts of the system to create, a lower carbon future, for example. Well, we had this hypothesis, and we started with this idea that said, we believe that technology is this tool, and with the right data and the right analysis and the right insights, you can drive high performance designs and lower your carbon footprint and improve your sustainable impact. But what we also know is that there's really lacking a true understanding of what good looks like. Lots of companies are doing this hard work, but they're doing it in many different ways. And we all want to get to the end goal of saying, oh, this is a really like environmentally responsible project, or built assets. But how we get there is actually quite opaque. So we started this initiative a few years ago whereby we said, what if we actually compare and contrast different practitioners and how they do this work? We partnered with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, a global organization that brings together some of the largest corporations to work collaboratively around industry transformation around sustainability in the built environment. And we got these member organizations together and said, let's see how we all do this hard work. And what's interesting is these are organizations who ostensibly compete against each other, to be awarded projects or to win a project, to build a building, for example. But we got this cohort of companies together and said, let's start with a common starting point and see how everyone does this hard work and compare it and see if there's some commonalities, identify if there's differences. So this happened to be a building-oriented project, but we took a building information model. Everyone had the same one. They all went off to their respective offices, and we had set up some workflows, and we said, try to calculate the carbon footprint of this building. And these 6 different companies went out and did that and came back with the results. And as our hypothesis was, we're not sure that everyone does the same thing. Let's see what the results are, starting with the same model. It proved our hypothesis that, in fact, the results were wildly different. In fact, the same model had a 34% variation in how a carbon footprint was measured. And we said, wow, that's really interesting. It not only proved the hypothesis, but it also should be quite an alarming fact for the industry to say, how do you know which way is right? How do you, and I'll be clear, the purpose of this work was not to get to a right answer. It wasn't to measure the actual, carbon footprint of this project. It was to understand the pathway, the process, and the methodologies that were followed so that we could interrogate whether there might be some ways that are, more common or potentially, more precise than others, and to very transparently be willing to share that. I go back to the competitive ecosystem here. Every company might be doing it their own way and they might think it's great, but how do we know which one is right when the numbers are 34% different? And so we built this fantastic cohort. Everyone was very transparent in sharing their work. We interrogated the why and the how of everybody's workflows, and we wrote up a report with a subsequent report that actually got into a set of guidelines. The idea being this wasn't just to help these 6 companies, get better at their job. Quite the contrary. Through the WBCSD as an organizing body, we want to make sure the whole world can understand that, first of all, the hypothesis that there's no one way, and just recognize that everyone's doing it kind of differently. Therefore, we don't know if the results are exactly right. And second, to put forward guidelines to sort of rise all ships, right? So everyone could be able to think about the different pain points or areas of uncertainty or areas where more transparency is needed about the assumptions or the calculations, methodology stuff, so that we can work across, this whole ecosystem. This is where the catalyzing ambition comes from my team is, in order to catalyze transformation, we have to start with understanding where the areas of opportunity are. And so this was an exercise to to discover that. So I'll leave it there. That was kind of the whole story about
Yeah, but
this pieces of work that we did, but I think we can build on that.
yeah, certainly. I mean, I remember attending the report and the session you've made for the first year report and this 34% variation and that's something that I think globally when you're into it you understand, you anticipate that, but maybe not that large as well. And when we enter
Yeah,
a project from um, because here it was all the same model, but a project, and especially I think in infrastructure as well, the phases are quite long when you are at early stage. There is a lot of hypothesis to be taken to go from um, early stage, low detail, low level of detail, and so
right.
on. And yeah, quite fascinating. And I really enjoy the fact that by doing this, um, bringing all these people together, it was demonstrating, measuring this. What's the biggest outcome you feel from the team involved? First,
Yeah.
maybe. Yeah.
You know, I used this word earlier about, it starts with just a basic awareness. Maybe there's a carrot, maybe there's a stick kind of
Mm,
motivating it. But for real change to happen, you can't just have a bunch of sustainability people caring about this. We need awareness by so many. I think one of the important outcomes of this work is not only kind of I'll say proving that hypothesis that it's not as easy as it looks. There's a lot of variation. It's unclear which way is right. Maybe there is no right way, but there's a lot of discrepancies out there. But is drive the awareness of the ecosystem who needs to care. So the, there were practitioners that were involved in driving the work too. These are experts in their field. They are sustainability pros and design and construction professionals who are domain experts in how to do this in their day jobs. But the awareness potential for that to now influence policymakers, standard setters, regulatory bodies, technology makers, technology partners. I think about the knock-on effects is if everyone were to read the findings of this work and say, oh my gosh, there's a 34% variation. Here are the things I can do in my day job, in my domain expertise, or in my sphere of influence. I think the greatest opportunity is for folks to see and be more aware of how this fundamental reality of how sustainability is done in practice today can shape the way standards might be written, the way regulatory bodies might say, the next threshold of performance, or, you can only get a building permit if you meet this
mm,
benchmark. Well, we're trying to expose the maybe oversimplification that the that practitioners can just do this work. Well, it's not that simple. There's lots of components, and I'll mention that in this project work, it wasn't just, Autodesk technology. It was actually, frankly, quite agnostic to Autodesk.
mm,
Sure, we started with the BIM model, but every one of these engaged parties, they used different tools. They used partner technologies. They used their own kind of homegrown, Excel spreadsheets and other kind of software post-processing things. There was a million ways to get to the end, right? And so in my mind, there's a million data points in which someone else can say,
mm.
aha, I can change what I'm building or making or writing into policy in a way that recognizes the reality of how the work gets done.
And as well, I think just to bounce, I think that, and you pointed out in terms of reporting capabilities, it shows us that okay, in terms of reporting, how do we make sure what's the uncertainty of these given results at the end? But on the other side, I don't know of how deep you look at that, but on the other side, if you look at what is impacting my results, where can I act to reduce this number? I would be interesting to know and to track if it has not been done. Whatever the results at the end, can we identify where I can have an impact as a practitioner to reduce this amount and by how much? I don't know. That's what do you think?
Yeah. Well, like I said, it starts with first understanding
Mm,
who's doing what, right? Because there are different spheres of influence and there's also different spheres of control. When I talked about the importance of bringing people together to collaborate and to be transparent, it's because there's a lot of different decision makers. And it's also really easy when you're not sure who owns decision making to say, oh, that's not my responsibility. That must be somebody else's. Or, oh, all I did was, I specified the performance of, how this material should be, but I'm not responsible for purchasing or procuring that material.
mhm,
That's somebody else's decision. Um, by being more transparent as a bunch of practitioners, making the built environment, I think transparency is the name of the game. So we can be more honest about what can we control, what decisions do I get to make, and where does that control get transferred to somebody else, so that it's understood that the impact of that decision is is accountable by whom,
mhm,
and that is where one can start to recognize where they can make improvements, right? Because it is there's a lot of stakeholders that are part of, you know, the the materializing of an idea into the reality, right? If we're gonna build a bridge or repair a building or renovate a hospital, there's a lot of people that are involved in that. And so for any one of those individuals involved in a multi-year effort to know what they can do to drive change, you've got to
mm,
understand what you can control. And so it's about being transparent and recognizing where the decision making lies. And then folks can work within their sphere of influence. And through transparency, I mean, what we're seeing through, for example, that project work is the ability for folks to say, "Here's what I can do now." When I hand it over to you, because you're now responsible for the next step or whatever, um, communicating that. That was actually one of the big takeaways of this report, of sort of guidelines for best practices. One of the big takeaways was write down your assumptions. What did you assume would happen to the next stakeholder who's going to carry
mhm.
this work forward? Because if they don't know what you were assuming, they might just make completely different decisions based on a different set of assumptions. And it's so important to document that, not just going to a project meeting and talking about it, but actually writing it down so you can say, oh, I had that assumption and it was X, Y, Z. So the next person who then carries the ball has to say, aha, that was the reason they had that assumption. Now it's on me to still meet that metric or target or goal.
Yeah, that seems obvious, but such a great advice. I mean, that's true. Everyone
It
is
does seem
thinking about,
obvious.
I will do this, it will improve. But at the end, if we don't know why, where you come from,
Yeah.
what you land on, and
Yeah.
that's key.
And I'll pull that back full circle, when I was talking a little bit about, digital transformation and, we're a technology company and we try to think about how can technology be an accelerator to, you know, how the world really gets designed and made. Well, it does come down to that data being
Mhm,
accessible, being communicated, being transparent. And so when we think about building like a place where people, I mean, I don't know about you, but I have a lot of paper on my desk over here. I still use paper, but you can't see my paper and I can't see what's on your desk. What we
mhm,
can share is, cloud-based, internet-powered data and analysis
mhm.
in a platform environment. And so it becomes like a hub where, if technology can just be this kind of interstitial space between where humans, are really driving decision making, um, there's this beautiful dynamic between it just being a means to an end. And so that's where, the oversimplification of it's all about data. Well, it's a place to keep and communicate and transparently show critical data that's needed for decision making.
Uh, Excellent. Thanks for that, Marta. I'd like to have also your view on so from your position, strategic position, you're involved into the whole AEC world, but from an infrastructure perspective? I mean, do you see different things, different decision
Mm.
maker? How is it evolving? I mean,
Yeah. So infrastructure is thankfully really emerging into a real area of focus by people like you and I, but also I think even governments and regulations. I'll just say, transportation alone, just the building of roads and highways and tailpipe emissions that come from vehicles is almost a quarter of our global greenhouse gas emissions. And yet, no one's paid a lot of attention to the impact that our infrastructure has had in its design and construction over the last, 100, 200 years. And, since the Industrial Revolution, it's just exponentially increasing. So I would say infrastructure is definitely having its day and being seen as a huge area of opportunity. It's both critical for, emerging industries, growing markets, populations, right? We've got, 10 billion people are expected to be on this planet by 2050. And so infrastructure is absolutely fundamental for humans to thrive. And that said, it does come with quite a big sustainable footprint. So where where I see things happening is, I think, going to be a lot more attentive on the infrastructure space. Let's just use that example I just described, this project with the WBCSC. Well, that was based on a building. And that became a very kind of well-contained area of study with architects and engineers who design and build buildings. Well, I'd love for that to be considered a proxy for what it means for much larger, infrastructural impacts that happens with, water distribution networks, road and highway networks, utility systems that need to span oceans. There's a huge area of opportunity where the sustainability of those large global systems is, I think, increasingly going to be scrutinized. And what's interesting, and especially given I mentioned my background being kind of on the building side, you know, is that the last decade or two, it was really it was a great kind of sandbox for our generation to start to assess and measure and ultimately manage sustainable impacts around buildings. You can measure your energy bills and your water bills and start to think about cost savings and designing higher performing buildings or renovations. Well, infrastructure hadn't really been an area of focus, partly because it was hard to measure. You didn't get a utility bill for your, cars driving down your highway. Those emissions were consumed by, our planet. It wasn't paid for by an owner or an asset operator. So we're now starting to recognize that 25% greenhouse gas emissions roughly impact had been unaccounted. And now we're really starting to say, we've got to measure that too. Sure, we sort of think we figured out how to do the building space because vertical infrastructure was, again, sort of more contained. But I'm really excited that right now what I see as not only an area of focus in my work and in the opportunities that Autodesk is trying to drive forward, but I think even just the wider ecosystem, working with you and, the peers at ORIS is just a great example of the entire kind of ripple effect of practitioners working in the infrastructure space who there's no place to go but up, right? Like we have so much like net new opportunity to think about sustainability and infrastructure because we are getting better at measuring it. We are starting to quantify and recognize the gaps that we have in the space of going, oh, actually, I have no idea where the materials came from. I should probably look into that, or I should probably start thinking about tailpipe emissions, for example. And so, that is about awareness, and it's also about readiness. I think the industry is ready. I think the marketplace is ready. The carrot and stick metaphor of, I think we have the right not only motivation by design firms and customers and partners and those, but also the regulations are starting to pay attention and drive change. So I'm pretty excited about it, to be honest. I think there's huge opportunities for impact, and I think we are digitally and physically ready to do something about it.
let's do it.
Yeah, right?
And
Let's do it.
yeah, I mean, there's many practitioners that I think are aware, wanted to start reducing, really controlling what
Yeah,
is emitted behind this, and with this regulation, everything in place, time is available for them to deliver such achievement.
yeah.
I think we are starting. It has started already, but accelerating into that change, certainly.
I think
Uh,
acceleration is the right word. I also think we have a lot to learn from and scale from the last couple of decades of learning, both on
mhm.
the technology side, on the regulation side. We can learn from the past, and we can hopefully move faster and accelerate as we head into the future, because it's a big industry to try to tackle, right? Infrastructure is a tricky one because it's not as cut and dried as a building, where you have property lines, and lots of infrastructure spans, large spaces and large entities, and different systems and domains, and ownership. And so there's a degree of complexity that comes with infrastructure, but I think we can learn from what's come before in maybe a more kind of contained domain around maybe buildings, so that we can scale it and accelerate the opportunity for a much more dynamic global industry.
And so we are getting close to the end, so that's a perfect transition. I think I'd like to hear your vision of, a bit looking
Okay.
forward. What's next? I mean, from a sustainability platform point of view, maybe, but also, what's next after carbon? We focused
Yes.
on carbon. We need to close on carbon. But beyond that, I
Yes.
think there are many questions on the table. So yeah, just your
Yeah.
perspective on these two questions.
Yeah, it's a great question. Right. So we talked about how carbon has been kind of a global metric that we can use. People have been able to kind of baseline to carbon, but that's not everything. I mean, it's a great starting point. And in fact, I think if we can kind of level set the industry around carbon, in my mind, that gives us the foundation or even the springboard to do what's next. So in the next couple of years, some of as we really mature on the measuring and managing of carbon, I'm really excited to think about the wider environmental influence of the built environment on things like biodiversity, the natural ecosystems around us. We've made quite a dent in our natural ecosystems, and so the notion of biodiversity is starting to say, if we were to design a world for the 10 billion population of the next 20 years,
Mhm.
well, whose homes are we taking over to make room for those homes for people? So biodiversity and the metrics and the measurement that come with it is definitely in the next frontier. um, Another huge and parallel topic is that of circularity, the idea of reuse. We have a fixed planet of materials
Mhm.
and resources. At some point, we cannot just, exploit all of it. And so the concept of circularity is around, how do we start to go from a more linear mindset, take, make, use, demolish, or throw away, to something that's take, make, repurpose, and reuse, and think about that as a more circular and more life cycle oriented approach to everything that we do. That'll be a pretty big transformation in terms of how we think about the jobs that we do now, the way that the world works today. But I think there's a lot of motivation around both biodiversity and circularity. They're interconnected, as a matter of fact, right? Reusing materials or repurposing something into something else is part of the ways we need to both protect our natural ecosystem and prepare for the next generation, or multiple decades into the future. Look, sustainability is complicated. We could go into many other aspects around human health and social welfare, and the list goes on. The hardest part every day is figuring out where to prioritize it.
Yeah, but I like also your vision on the change. I think today, I've seen this question. That's the questions that you asked before starting any project in a feasibility stage and so on, you make a first assessment and then you decide to go. And once you decide to go, it's probably a bit less part of a daily job. It's not something that you consider constantly at every decision that you are taking. So how do we embed that into this workflow as structural resistance or safety or
Yeah.
cost, adding more dimension to that to then take the decision, a balanced decision for the best of this infrastructure. And I can see that in the future. Of course, maybe without rushing, carbon is not a finished question. We need still to scale
It's
that
not perfect yet.
globally. But I can see that, yeah, that sustainability platform connecting all these dimensions.
Yeah.
That's great. And maybe to close, I'd like to ask also what would be your advice to someone listening to us that is really dedicated to infrastructure, having some impact on sustainability? What can be done today? I like your part also on what you can act on. That was the question earlier. But yeah, what would be
Yeah.
your advice here?
Yeah. I get this question a lot from all sizes and shapes of people, new in their career, very experienced, and maybe just curious. But the simple answer is just start somewhere. There's no big, you know, secret book about how to do sustainability, and only the keepers of the key to the book are the ones that get to do this work. I feel lucky and privileged to have a career in sustainability, 2 decades of practicing. And that's given me the perspective to know that there's no silver bullet. There's no like one shot easy button that just gets it right. And it's this ecosystem mindset, and every little bit counts, because going back to one's sphere of influence or sphere of control, in the realm of which one has control, there are steps that can be taken. There are acts that one can make without feeling, overwhelmed by, saving the world, which is just a euphemism for something so ridiculously big that nobody can control that. Think about what you can control and just take small steps, because it isn't just any one person who will independently, solve sustainability or create like a net zero, no carbon, no impact. It's impossible. It's absolutely unrealistic. And so sustainability is fundamentally a series of trade-offs, a series of, impacts that affect so many different things. So think about what you can control and take small steps where you can, and know that the next person down the line or behind you or next to you could do the same. And how can you empower them to take the same small step? And a whole lot of small steps is a marathon. So that's how we get there.
Thanks a lot, Marta. Thank you for joining us today, and amazing piece of experience, advice, and the impact you can have with this ecosystem and the approach you're leading at Autodesk. Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
Any conclusion you want to share?
This is wonderful, Renaud. Thanks for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to work with partners like you to tackle this big, complex challenge, and to recognize that we share this mindset that in the worlds that we've built, we can each kind of work forward. And so I think what's interesting about our collaborations and what we at Autodesk see with other partners and customers and agencies and standards bodies and all the things, we work really hard to make those connections happen and to empower folks to work with us to drive that change forward. It's a very inspiring place to be able to work, and it's so fun to find partners like you that want to sort of face that frontier with us. So thank you for the partnership, and I look forward to continued collaborations.
Thanks a lot, Marta, and see you soon.
Yeah, see you soon, Renaud. Thanks.